Good afternoon, everyone, and hello to friends online. Guten Tag, guten Abend. I'm not quite sure for friends from the Church and Peace Network, which I know is particularly strong in Germany. Good afternoon and welcome. It's been a busy morning of business for the fellowship, and this afternoon we look out and we look wider, and it's good to have had the support of the Church and Peace Network to think about the topic, and Lydia's going to lead some closing reflections at the end to finish our day in worship. Thinking about what we could think and reflect on to help spur us for the year ahead, one of the main messages that began to emerge is, particularly if you look out in the broader world, it feels like you have in particular a lot of men pushing up against each other, trying to prove they're the strongest. And both within Christian theological thinking, where the writer Will Moore has been doing a lot of work considering new perceptions on masculinity. Actually, it's time to begin to look beyond the men, look much wider, and listen in more deeply to the many different places, spaces, and people who help create peace. But then the tricky bit comes. If you've got the idea, who do you then choose? I was just sharing that I'd spotted a train with a white ribbon on it when I stood waiting for an event. And then we decided on this theme. And I remembered someone I was always deeply respectful of and really quite valued their work. Anthea Sully, who is now Chief Executive of White Ribbon UK, who I'd first encountered many years ago when she was a leading light in the Methodist Church, helping engage with the wider world. And for me, helping actually do what our faith calls us to do. Reading more deeply as to what she does now, she doesn't just act as Chief Executive of the White Ribbon UK, she also works on the Ecumenical Forum of European Christian Women, which means in many respects a big foot in the secular world and a tiny toe, helping keep grounded within the faith world. And it's that combination of perspectives, that broad experience, and just the huge impact within the UK, which the White Ribbon campaign is currently having, enabling more people to speak up against violence against women, I think makes her just the key choice for the afternoon. So Anthea, thank you so much and welcome.
Thank you, John. It's great to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation. And I'm trying to think when I've done a kind of hybrid meeting like this. It's slightly new for me, so I speak in many different formats. But forgive me if I accidentally forget people who are not present in the room, but I will work really hard to remember you're here, and I can see you just down there to my left. Thank you for the introduction and saying a bit about my current role as Chief Executive of White Ribbon UK, and I'll speak a bit more about that as we continue. And I'm going to go on a little bit of a journey through some of the things that I have done that I think intersect with your purpose. I'm recognising that I'm in a room or a space, a live space of people with passion, commitment, expertise and history. And a lot of that is in spaces that I'm aware of, I've touched against, but it's not my areas particularly of expertise. So I'm bringing the things that I know and I've experienced to that. And I'm hoping that in the spaces that we can create a richer picture of how we can all look to make a difference towards peace and reconciliation in the world. So let me start by going back to February the 15th, 2003. I don't know whether anybody knows why that was a significant date, but I'm sure you will soon. Those who are a little bit older. I was sitting in a room, quite a large room, conference hall space in Glasgow, and I was listening to a speech that was where a man was telling me about a letter he had received from two women in Afghanistan, thanking him for the intervention of British troops, that they were now able to live freer lives. The person speaking was Tony Blair, and it was the day of the big march in London and also globally against against action at that point, the war in Iraq. It was a real I was there moment. We were only a few of us, there was a very small number of us allowed into the space, and Labour Party representatives were lining down either side of the walls, waiting to deal with anybody who spoke out or whatever. I'd gone into that space. I don't know whether open-minded is the right way to talk about it, but it was uncertain about what we should be thinking and how we should be reflecting on this. I didn't come with a idea that I was totally against war at that time. It was the moment of speaking about that letter, of the experience of women, that I immediately knew how wrong action would be. It had been taken out of context and it was being used. It was women's experience being used in that way. And I also didn't feel it was genuine. It didn't have that ring of truth. And of course, as we look at what happened subsequently, it probably wasn't. I was attending the Labour Spring Conference, which is what the occasion was, because at that point I was the leader of the Labour group on Peterborough City Council. So I had some representational responsibilities within that. And I'd also only 2 years earlier been a Labour Party parliamentary candidate, and I'd stood against Brian Mulwiney, who was the chair of the Labour Party at the time, chair of the Conservative Party. That would have been interesting at the time. So a very significant, heavyweight political figure. And at that time, I'd had the responsibility of speaking Labour Party policy and making sure that that was delivered. I left the hallway, the big hall. I actually physically ducked under the press who were waiting to speak to people who had been there. Went through the double police cordon that was outside and joined the protest march in Glasgow. And I walked, because I'd arrived at a slightly strange time, having been at the speech, I walked backwards through it and found people to talk to and found out why they were there, and it was really interesting. Over the next few weeks, I found myself addressing one of the largest peace demonstrations I'd ever been to in Peterborough. It's quite a small place, but it was a very large demonstration for Peterborough. And I told the crowd very specifically, Tony Blair is wrong. Prior to this, I'd had several calls from Eastern Region Labour Party wanting to prevent me speaking. And that's despite being a really small city, and I don't think the global news was really all that interested, however powerful my speech was at the demonstration. It was only at this time that I finally became a member of CND because of the interactions that were happening around that. And it was also during this time that I was appointed as the coordinating secretary for public life and social justice at the Methodist Church. And a shift in my life from a very secular political environment into a faith environment. So in September that year, I started in that role, becoming responsible for the political and public and policy work of the Methodist Church, both in the UK and globally. And also part of my responsibility was the oversight of the Methodist Forces chaplains. Things came together there. And that was fascinating because when I first met with them, I think only about a month after I was in post, they were describing their direct experiences of being in Iraq and as part of that action. So the joining together of live experience and from what had been proposed and from the millions of people who had marched against that action, and then realising what churches were expecting people to do as part of their chaplaincy, and the responsibility that we had put upon our forces was very apparent. So in the intervening 20 years since then, I've worked in really quite a few different organisations and in different sectors, both nationally and internationally. As you've already heard, my current role is Chief Executive of White Ribbon UK. We're the leading charity working in England and Wales, despite our name, that engages with men and boys to end violence against women, to prevent violence against women, by working to challenge those expressions of masculinity and the cultures that are part of that are the causes of violence. So today I want to bring that experience into our conversation about peace and reconciliation. I want to look from that moment in Glasgow 20 years ago, and I'm sort of joining it up to October last year, because that's a point when Andrew Tate, the blogger, social media person, people are nodding so they're aware who he is, a person with deeply misogynistic views who puts a lot of material out on social media and is currently under house arrest. I think I'm up to date on this, in Romania, facing charges of rape and sexual assault. So I'm bringing those things together and sort of bookending where I'm going to be talking in terms of looking at those things. And when we think about Andrew Tate, it's important that we think about that he has millions strong audience. So I want to think about expressions of masculinity in war and violence, and how they all intersect, and how masculine traits that cause such violence within our society and within our homes are part of this global picture of violence. And I hope some of the positive ways that White Ribbon works in order to enable men to nurture positive traits and learn to be allies to women also come through. So some caveats. I'm very aware that I'm speaking as a white, privileged woman. I want to be intersectional. I still have to learn what that means. I particularly speak about men's violence, but we need to be aware that violence affects everybody. All people can be violent. I am, however, speaking and unashamedly speaking about very specific aspects of masculinity that need to be challenged. And if they are challenged, completely believe that violence against women and more widespread violence can be changed. There is a problem with men's violence way beyond violence against women. It's something we have to talk openly about. So in the introduction to speaking, I said I wanted to look at countering strongman politics. So let's just think for a moment about what this concept of strong man is, if we think about this sort of globally. And I wondered if anybody would like to suggest to me any current candidates they think might come under that phrase.
Benjamin Netanyahu?
Yes, thank you.
Prime Minister of Israel.
Yeah, I don't know whether people can hear me hear that. So it's I'm glad you pronounced his name as well. Benjamin Netanyahu from in Israel. Someone's put Putin, thank you. Putin.
The right wing in America, suppose Donald Trump would do that.
Yes, Donald Trump.
And the whole MAGA movement.
Mm-hmm.
In a strange way, I think Boris Johnson cuddling up to Zelensky felt like he was trying to be strongman.
Yes. Boris Johnson. Okay.
Well, one of my questions was, do we think British, so there are some British politicians who fall into that category. So those were certainly some of the names that came to my mind. Of course, we noticed that Donald Trump was very recently in the news for his misogyny, sexism, and now confirmed violence towards women. If you think about Putin, and I put the word masculinity to you, is there a picture, an image that comes to your mind? Because there is to mine, and I think there is to many people.
A horrible one of him stripped to the waist.
On a horse, yes. So how interesting that is. And I think for many of us, this is a very confusing way somebody is expressing themselves. So for those of you who, once you see it, you can't unsee it. So for those of you who are unaware, it's from some years ago, but there's a photograph of Putin stripped to the waist on a horse, I think in water. It's very, it's a surprising and odd image, but that's very clearly a way he's seeing himself and this expression of masculinity and something that he's wanting to project. I have no background in psychology that can unpick that, but I think it's something that we need to recognise, how these individuals project in surprising ways and ways that anchor in our minds. And we need to remember that they are popular. Because I think all of us, with the names that we've said, are horrified by these people. But that is not the critical view. So they are popular. There's something that we're needing to challenge there. If we just go back to Andrew Tate, so not a politician, before being banned on Instagram, he had 4.6 million followers. And on TikTok, before he was banned, the hashtag Andrew Tate had accumulated 12.7 billion views. We are consuming this hyper-masculinity as a society. And one of the very terrifying things about Andrew Tate was, I first came across him because I was asked by a newspaper to give a comment. I'd never heard of him, but if you asked any 15-year-old boy, most of them a year before, they would have all known who he was because he was talked about in schools. So this is a really challenging thing for us, that we have these people who are leaders, I suppose, in many different walks of life, who are very popular and presenting this hyper masculinity. This is a slight side note to this, but I think it's important because it's not talking about men who are leaders, but one of the things that I think it is important to note that counter-terrorism policing have identified a significantly higher prevalence of interaction with domestic abuse, either as an offender, a victim, witness, or a combination of all those three, for people referred to the PREVENT programme than in the wider population. I know there's issues with the PREVENT programme, but that is significant. And there's a very traceable link between terrorist activities and violence and abuse towards women. And we don't hear this, so it's not joined up. So in 2017, there were two attacks that are notable. So Darren Osborne was the right-wing extremist who drove a van into worshippers leaving a mosque in North London, and Khalid Masood, who staged the attack on Westminster Bridge. Both had abused women and both had criminal records for violent offences. So this is related. Terrorist violence and other aspects of violence are nearly always linked into violence against women and examples of misogynistic views. I think I haven't written this down, but one of the things that I don't feel is spoken about enough is that the attack on the Manchester Arena, not so far away from here, clearly had aspects of gender-related violence and also hate crime against LGBTQ plus communities within it, but we don't recognise those aspects of it. It was a targeted attack on that particular audience. And also there's now more awareness of incel culture, ideology. So this is networks of men now who feel that they've been denied social and romantic relationships, and that women are to blame for this. And at its extreme, they condone violence, including sexual violence against women, and there's been a significant number of attacks by these groups of men. And actually, White Ribbon itself was founded in Canada 30 years ago by what we would now call an incel attack, because a man went to a university campus in Montreal, sought out women who were studying engineering, lined them up against the wall, and murdered them. And I think it was 14 women who were murdered that time. And out of that violence, it was men in Canada who said, we need to change this. The additional trauma of being in a society, in a community where gun violence was not something that was usual or expected. And in saying that story, I think it opens up how we perceive masculinity in the gun violence that's happening in the States and in other places. So this is my first part of talking about. I'm looking at the time, my goodness, right. And do we have any examples we can think of in the Bible of men who show this strongman type of leadership?
Gideon.
Sorry?
Gideon.
Yes, that's interesting. Gideon, sorry, I have people who couldn't hear. David, yeah.
Caris is suggesting Samson.
Right. I think as Christians, we need to be careful that we don't succumb to that we don't fail to see stories in the Bible and how we use them and where we and how we engage with them. So the one example I was just wanting to pull out from that was David. Heroic person presented in this way. Certainly when I went to Sunday school, that's what happened. And yet we have this story where he sees a woman, he wants to own her, objectifies her, takes her, and then removes her husband from the scene by making sure he's on the front line, and also effectively murders him. That is shocking violence against women and violence generally. We're not presented it in that way in terms of that story. It's important that we challenge ourselves when we're engaging with biblical content and recognising the complexities of that, because people aren't one-person monsters. Actually, we can all have aspects of this. How do we change things so people don't present those kinds of challenges? So I'm going to, at the end, I've got the 3 questions that we might want to think about that I'm going to let you know in advance as we go through. So my first question is going to be, the first question at the end is going to be, is a pacifist position possible when dealing with strongman politics, when dealing with these people? So I'm going to move on now to the role of the church, and some questions about that. My next 2 sections are slightly shorter. This is when I was directly working for a Methodist church, and I think you were at this event. So 14th of March 2007, I was in Parliament Square speaking at the rally, at the CND rally, which was taking place as Parliament voted for the renewal of Trident. the vote was only carried with the support of Conservative MPs. And this speech and this whole activity was one of the first projects of the new joint public issues team that I had co-founded around that time, and it enabled us to go to the three traditions in that team: the Methodist Church, the Baptist Union of Great Britain, and the United Reformed Church. And we went through all our different processes as organisations. And I was able to stand on the stage and speak with some authority that I was speaking on behalf of thousands of members of all those church traditions to say, we must not renew Trident. This was backed up, as well as that speaking action in that moment, with engaging with politicians, writing to the Defence Committee, and it was owned by all our church traditions. And I know there's some work to be done to make sure did everybody in every church know that this had happened. But it was a significant thing for a church, and very different from how many churches choose to do their engagement. Of course, the energy of that felt great. Felt great as a church that we were doing that. Felt really good speaking. It was a good campaign. We didn't manage to stop the renewal of Trident. How do we reconcile those challenges and ask ourselves, do we keep trying? As John said, for several years I was involved with the Conference of European Churches, first as the moderator of the Church and Society Commission, and later as a member of its Central Committee. It was a very diverse body, and it was so revealing of the approaches of different churches and how they interacted with national structures and public issues. And of course, some churches were state churches. We lost the Russian Orthodox Church because the Estonian Orthodox Church wanted to be an individual member of the Conference of European Churches. And we had the strangest situation where people from Protestant traditions were voting to enable the Estonian Church to become an autonomous member within that. And at that point, the Russian Orthodox Church left the room quite dramatically. But it showed the interaction between politics, national boundaries, and how all those things came together in that complex situation. I was pleased to see that KEC has a new plan titled Pathways to Peace, working to promote justice, reconciliation and peace, especially in the context of the war in Ukraine. And that will enable KEC to strengthen its role in having that dialogue in very complex conversations, and not ones that would necessarily seem straightforward. KEC was born out of the Cold War and has been a key voice within European institutions. But I do want to put some cautions in place. My experience of it was that many of the churches were deeply hierarchical. And there have been instances of member church within KEC speaking out against what I think are important pieces of work. So, for example, the Istanbul Convention, Council of Europe Convention in Ending Violence Against Women, has been opposed by the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in 2017, the Polish Orthodox Church, the Catholic Church of Croatia, and also joint churches in Lithuania. Not only Orthodox and Catholic, but also Evangelical Reformed and Evangelical Lutheran. And the objection is that is one against the concept of equality, and that men and women have defined roles, and this will therefore tear apart the fabric of the family. I find that very disturbing in a setting where it's looking to end violence. It's like almost condoning violence as long as it keeps our structures. So we do have to address power structures and hierarchies within our churches. And I do passionately believe that churches should be speaking to wider society and governmental institutions, but we also need to have an awareness of ourselves. And also that ordinary women and men of faith should draw together outside these structures and find ways that they campaign and speak out, which I think is who I'm talking to today. And also developing relations with non-faith-based campaigns. So just after I left my job at the Methodist Church, I had a really interesting conversation with a leading Methodist who was hearing what I was doing next, which was working alongside people with learning disabilities in campaigning for better funding for social care. So it's a very different thing. And I was talking about the impact we were having in that. And he said, are we as churches delusional, claiming we have influence? So I'd had 5 years. I'd been into 10 Downing Street, 11 Downing Street, into Westminster, into the EU institutions, and many other things as well. Are we delusional? So my question 2 for the end is, does the church in the West continue to play the so-called Western liberal democratic system, or should we be looking at other models of engaging? Big questions, aren't they, for a Saturday afternoon? I'm not sure how far we get, but the questions are good questions, I think. So my third area of consideration, am I okay keeping going like this, and we'll have some time? So because I've spoken about women peacemakers, I'm not going to give a great detail or list this. I'm going to ask in a moment if people want to share their experience of women peacemakers, because that would be really helpful to me to see where that was. But I'm going to start with one story, Shipley, which is where I live, which is just up the road or along the train line. 21st of January 2017, a sister march, which we held, taking place in solidarity with the thousands of women marching upon Washington, speaking out against Donald Trump's presidency. So there were 1,500 of us marching in Shipley. The population of Shipley is 28,000, so that's quite a high percentage of the population there. There's an important dimension to this march. Not everybody will be aware of the whose constituency Shipley is, but it is the Conservative MP Philip Davis, a significant supporter of Trump and famous for filibustering items which specifically often talk about violence against women. His context for that is that we need to talk about violence against everybody, and he also regularly speaks at pro-men's conferences. So we haven't met regularly, but I have been a very proud member of the Shipley Feminist Zealots, because one of the things that's a factor when we meet, if people aren't in first language English, I hope they can cope with this. When we meet, we have cake, and this is because one of his famous sayings was that feminist zealots wanted to have their cake and eat it. So, and we have invited him to have cake with us, which he has declined. But we've had so there's a very specific reason why the march against women in Shipley, although it being very small, was important and significant. So out of that, it was amazing to be part of that small demonstration and meet up with so many local women, with us all having this shared agenda and talking about that. And then you put that into the millions of women who protested worldwide. And one of my questions is, where and how do those voices and the experience of women in that get drawn into making lasting change? We know that many women will will have been inspired into further activism, and will be facing significant challenges in doing so. And we need to note that women who are working towards peace, I haven't mentioned campaigning about climate change, which is an important thing that women are so involved in, will have gendered aggression directed towards them in that environment. There's an additional dimension that women are facing when they are active, and we need to remember this. Also, I'm not going to say this, but one of the things that I worked on when I was working with the Methodist Church was about political extremism, and we spoke out about the BNP, the British Nationalist Party, at that time. I am so grateful this was not at a time when we had social media. I received a lot of death threats, had to have a special police number for that. And one of the things that was important to note in that was the sexist and gendered way some of that was brought to me. Also, not with the Methodist Church, but other church traditions didn't choose to speak out. And I will name the Church of England, who said that they were behind the statement, my surname is different then, but behind the statement made by me and named me, but gave no person within them in terms of their statement. So that's these are how these things can play out. And that was a tiny thing. I look at the abuse that women are receiving online in particular, and other ways who are campaigning for peace against climate change, and in many ways, and it is really, really, it is so horrific, and I don't know how they manage to continue in that environment. So just very briefly, I wonder what women and women's movements have inspired people here, and perhaps individual women. Are there things that people want to share into?
I've always been impressed by Wangari Maathai from Kenya and the Green Belt movement, and how she used to talk about planting trees as an act of resistance. Both the community sense of the community coming together to plant the trees, and that sort of defeating the violence in the resistance to the tree planting, but the fact that it was seen as a small thing. And yet,
Right.
you know, sort of 10, 20, 30 years later, there are all these trees growing
Right.
that
So a small thing
symbolise
that's
sort of, her rights.
okay. Other, yes.
There's an American woman who is dead now. She died in 1985, called Barbara Deeming.
Right, Barbara Deeming is the name that's being given across for the, yes?
Yeah, and she's inspired me because in her writings about both walking the streets with women and also going to prison for her peace activities, she's found a philosophy which is about the two hands. And she says that the one hand says very definitely, no, you will not go further. The one hand says, no, you will not go further. I resist you. And the other hand says, let us engage, let us treat each other as human beings. And Barbara Deeming's philosophy, that's as simply as it is.
Oh, that's wonderful, thank you. I really appreciate that, and I didn't know about that. Anyway, sorry, yes, Dennis.
Dennis, have a microphone.
Thanks. Of course, in the I4 context, International Fellowship of Reconciliation, and indeed within Britain, one of the 6 I4 Nobel Peace Prize winners is Mairead Corrigan Maguire,
Yes,
who of course led the peace people in Northern Ireland,
Yes.
inspired by the murder of a child.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
quite often it's the women who have to deal with the fact of violence against children.
Yes, she was one of the people that came to my mind as well, and think also I still feel very, somebody added something there, no. I still regret not being a Greenham woman. That wasn't where I was. I was also living here, which is a very long way. But I've been very moved and inspired by women, Greenham women, who have walked alongside me in different parts of my life, doing very different things, and how their lives were changed by that, and how they have gone on to change wider society. So, mentioned briefly the Ecumenical Forum of European Christian Women. We have members across wider Europe, and and women from all different church traditions working in and living in very different circumstances. Very aware at the moment of our sisters in Ukraine. We managed to get them to our General Assembly in Strasbourg in August last year. It was amazing. It involved various buses and planes and all kinds of things. But to hear directly from them, and also in the context of knowing them living in that situation, and their huge desire for peace, and their wanting the West and the rest of Europe to take action, direct action. It's very challenging to hear, and also being very aware of how they can be challenged by being in their own church traditions, and all those things together. And that's something that's that's spoken about, I think, by all of us. Those things we're living in our national context, and we're also living in our church context. And the church contexts aren't always the safest place for us to be. So my question, my third question, and I'll just give a very brief closing then, is how do we enable voices of women and others, other minoritised groups, to become embedded in functional structural change? Because one of the things that can be so observed of women peacemakers is that it's seen as being a little add-on. It's not like the real peacemaking. It's something that's happening as a kind of side activity. It's not seen as being in the core of that piece of work. And we need to think about that. And it's not only in terms of the women's movements for peace, but it's in other movements for peace and for social justice. How do we ensure that people who are really active in that are enabled to be making the change? So that's my third question. So a couple of points. There is a problem with expressions of masculinity and its relationship with violence across the board. We must understand that gendered violence is part of that picture, even when it comes to interstate wars. We need to look comprehensively at violence from the domestic into that national picture. We can change this. At White Ribbon, we say by working together we can positively change this. We can end violence against women. I firmly believe that, but it needs some work, and it can't be women who are doing all the heavy lifting. So we have to work on that. The concept of allyship that's been brought so powerfully into our awareness by the Black Lives Movement is really helpful to us here, and we encourage men to be allies to women and to other people. Learn about how to be an ally, be receptive, being invited into being an ally, listening, yielding, giving space, and supporting. I also probably should end with a Bible quote. So, and this is coming a bit left field and out of the thing, but very recently I was at a event in Beverley Minster, and the new Bishop of Hull spoke and was speaking about White Ribbon. So that was interesting to be in a faith environment talking about White Ribbon. And she based her talk to us all on Mark 14, verse 6. And the words, leave her alone. It's the account of Jesus being anointed and Jesus saying, leave her alone. Leave her alone. Why are you bothering her? Because people are agitated that this money has been spent on oil to anoint him. And the point really landed with me, leave her alone. And she said, we have all these words of Jesus on posters and here, there, and everywhere. And she said, has anybody ever seen the words, leave her alone? How different human history would be if we had emphasised those 3 words sometimes. Leave her alone. And I expand that. In a time when we will often describe nations as her, won't we? So we could describe Ukraine as a her. And we could say to Putin, leave her alone. It's in that picture we see it very much as being men who are speaking out against the woman who anoints Jesus. So I want us to hold those 3 words. We talk very much with our White Ribbon ambassadors and people at White Ribbon. We want to give people strategies. So after the murder of Sarah Everard, I was repeatedly asked by the media for a checklist of how men could not be violent and could help women. And I was incredibly resistant to this. It's like, you don't need a checklist to know how to be a good man. You really don't need a checklist. And I've moved a bit from that because actually we do need strategies to know how to not be violent, don't we? We need ways to understand that. We need some ideas. One of the things that we give when we're doing very specific talks to groups in workplaces is the phrase to remember, I'm not okay with that. So if you experience banter and you hear a sexist joke or something makes you uncomfortable, you have a phrase you can pull out the back of your mind and go, I'm not okay with that. Can we all remember the phrase, leave her alone? Thank you.